Okay, so thank you for being here tonight. I appreciate it. Let's start with a prayer and then we'll get into the lecture. Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for affording us this time to get together. Thank you for just the opportunity that we have to meet together and to learn a little bit about the history that you have laid out for us. I pray that you will give time and blessing to those who put out the effort to learn something that you were trying to teach them in this class. Lord, I just ask that you would continue to provide that time, that you would provide that blessing, that you would make connections, and that they would grow deep roots, Lord, that we would understand the beginnings of our faith and where we are today. And we ask it all in your name, Jesus. Amen. Okay, so tonight, finally, we're to King Henry VIII, which we're 2 lectures behind, but that's okay. We'll figure out what to do about that. All right, so this is busy, but if I can lay this out right, I think it'll make some sense. Okay, so just to kind of set a little bit of a stage, like a 2-minute stage here, what we've talked about up to this point is what began with Martin Luther in 1517 with his theses, right? And the printing press and all that came with it. And we learned a little bit about some other reformers, a Swiss reformer named Zwingli and a Scottish reformer named Knox, and who else did we learn about? Calvin, a French reformer named Calvin. And we learned about a Catholic monk he was a soldier turned monk named Loyola, right? He started the Jesuits. Or he came up with this idea, and the Pope actually had to institute the group, but he was sort of the founder of the Jesuits. So all of this is happening in all of these other countries around Europe, right? So we were talking about what we call Germany and what we call France and, all these areas, Switzerland. Okay, so now let's go to England. And let's talk a little bit about Henry VIII. As you know, the lens that we look through for this class is with the viewpoint of church history and how church history was formed or affected, right? So when you look at, or when you think of Henry VIII, by and large, most people do not think church history. They think of secular history, right? And he definitely has lots of secular history that we are not going to talk about tonight. But interestingly enough, he plays a major role in church history as well. So he was the King of England. He ruled from 1509 to 1547. At the time that he was in power, there was a strong sense of nationalism in England. An example of that nationalism is, at one point, basically King Henry, or the people that rule with him or alongside him, they were saying, well, we're England, and actually he was also ruling over Ireland and some, as well, but we're sticking with England. Anyway, we have this is our own land and our own people, right? And we have the Catholic Church that's established, so it's the Church of England, right? It's the Catholic Church that's in England, right? So I'm sorry, I said that backwards. It is the Catholic Church in England. So there's one Catholic Church, and sort of the root is in Italy, right? And then there is a branch of that church in England. So it's the church in England, right? Okay, that's important to get the in the oven. I've already gotten you confused. So in England is where we're starting. So anyway, so King Henry or his compatriots, they're saying, well, we're England and they're way over there in Italy. Why are we sending all of our money, tithes and whatnot, taxes? Why are we sending all that stuff to Italy? Why aren't we keeping it here where our churches are and our priests are and our people are? And, those kinds of questions started forming. They were the same questions that had been asked by other churches at different points in time. And again, he was not a priest, he was not a pope, he was not in any way affiliated in leadership, ecclesiastically in leadership in the church. He was the ruler of the land that the church was in, right? So, he's thinking, well, maybe he's really thinking, why am I not getting that tax? Right? I don't know. Whatever. Just throwing it out there. So this idea of nationalism had already taken hold, and it feeds into a little bit of what happens later on. Okay, so Henry VIII had 6 wives. We're going to talk about 3 of them. And it's important because the products of those 3 marriages were the future rulers of England, and they play a part in church history as well. So let's just go through Henry VIII's wives and kind of the order that he was getting married, and we'll talk a little bit about the kids that were produced from each marriage, okay? So his first wife was Catherine of Aragon. She was Ferdinand and Isabella's daughter. So you remember who they are. They were sort of responsible, if you want to take that viewpoint, for the Spanish Inquisition. I mean, secularly, there's also the discovering of India, blah, 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 right, with Columbus. Anyway, so their daughter, Catherine of Aragon, married Henry VIII in 1509 and was married to him until 1533. It was a fairly long marriage. Now, remember that at this time, and actually still even outside of royalty or rulers, a lot of the one of the main goals of getting married and having a family is to produce an heir, is to produce a son to carry on the name. In this case, it's not only the name, it's actually a ruler over a country, right? So what Henry VIII wanted out of these marriages were sons. He wanted heirs to come out of them, right? So Catherine gave him a daughter named Mary Tudor. Later on, she's also known as Mary I whenever she takes the rule. And as time goes on, she's also known as Bloody Mary. When you read Fox's Book of Martyrs, the Queen Mary that they were talking about, it was this Mary. Okay? She ruled from 1553 to 1558, whatever. Okay, we'll go back to some of that in a little bit. So interestingly enough, so Henry and Catherine are married. They've had this daughter. Things are going along seemingly fine. He cannot seem to get a son produced that survives, right? So he begins to wander a little bit. His eyes begin to wander a little bit. And he ends up meeting, or whatever, this woman named Anne Boleyn. She was one of Catherine's ladies in waiting. So she was one of the people who personally attended to the queen. Okay? So as time went on, his wandering eye became more intense, and they began an affair of sorts. And he decided that he didn't want to be married to Catherine anymore for various reasons, one of which that was spoken was she was not able to give him a son, right? So Henry asked the Catholic Church, his authority, right, that's locally in England, asked this archbishop, I'd like you to annul our marriage. I'd like you to dissolve our marriage because I want to marry this chick down here.
Is that the first annulment?
No, well, it wasn't an annulment because the Catholic Church said, we can't do that. You've been married for years. You have a child from this marriage. I mean, you can't annul a marriage that is that long-standing, and that's not how this works. Well, Henry didn't like the answer. And so basically what happened, while he was still married to Catherine, actually it was a little bit after, 1534, it was right in the middle of him being, his daughter reigning, but just after Catherine died, he ended up forming what we call the Church of England. And it all comes basically from him wanting to divorce Catherine. I want to divorce Catherine. The church, who is his, marriage authority, says, no, you can't do that. And he says, well, I don't like that answer. And so as the sovereign king of England, I'm going to form my own church. And we're going to call it the Church of England. It's no longer going to be the Catholic Church that has a branch in England. We are now going to be the Church of England, and it's going to be separate from what the church in Rome is doing. Okay? Now, Do not be mistaken to think that Henry VIII did not have respect for the Catholic Church, because he did. He did not change the doctrine of the church. What he wanted was control over whether or not he could get married or divorced, right? And there were probably other things thrown in there too, but this was the primary thing. So when he formed this Church of England, I mean, he fired the archbishop that he didn't, he formed his own church, fired the archbishop, pulled in somebody who's going to play ball with them, and then ended up having this marriage annulled. And to answer your question, I mean, I should have put this is what I should have done. The marriage was annulled, because there's no way that the Catholic Church at large would have ever recognized that, right? So this marriage, so maybe it was the first annulment. I actually don't know the answer to that, but it's not really an annulment. It was just a divorce, right? But it was recognized as okay by the church. That was the big thing, because he wanted to get married again. He wanted his kids to be in the church. I mean, he still wanted all the benefits of the church, but he wanted to have control over basically getting rid of Catherine and being able to marry Anne Boleyn. By the time they got married in 1533, she was already pregnant. Okay, so this affair had already been started, and by 1534, he had firmly established this separate entity called the Church of England. And what's really, really important to understand about the Church of England is that it was a change in the government of the church. He declared an act of supremacy. And basically, this act of supremacy said that the King of England is justly and rightly ought to be the supreme head of the Church of England. So he basically started his own church, declared himself the supreme pope, if you will. I mean, declared himself the supreme authority over that church, but then used all the doctrine, except what he didn't agree with, all the doctrine from the church that was established out of Rome. So this was not called, whenever the Church of England was established, many people will call it a reformation. It is not a reformation. By definition, a reformation is a change in doctrine. That's why the Protestant Reformation is a reformation. It's a break away from the Catholic doctrine, right? This was basically the same nuts and bolts doctrine. There were a few differences. I mean, this marriage stuff and whatever, but eternity, speaking in terms of eternity and lifestyle for the most part, he stuck hard to what he had grown up with out of the church in Rome. So it was a change in government over the church, but it was not a reformation. And that will, I can almost promise you, be a test question. Okay? So he basically breaks off and forms his own church so that he can get what he wants as far as marriage. Because again, ultimately, whether or not he truly loved Catherine, he truly loved Anne, he truly loved his next wife or his other three wives, whatever, ultimately the goal is we've got to produce an heir. We have to produce an heir. And if we don't, we're going to lose the throne, right? So, Catherine of Aragon, this is their marriage, not her life. This is their marriage. Dating. Catherine of Aragon was replaced basically with Anne Boleyn. They were married. She had a daughter, and her name is Elizabeth I. She was... This is her birth date. I have all these dates and I didn't really give them to you. I'm sorry. This date is the date of the marriage with King Henry. Okay? So, Catherine was married to Henry from 1509 to 1533. Henry was married to Anne from 1533 to 1536. That's what these dates, right next to the wives' names, it's the length of their marriage. Next to the children, next to their name, this is the date of their life. And then underneath, the date of their rule, okay? Which we'll get to their ruling in a minute. I just want you to, I didn't really explain the dates and that gets confusing if I'm not clear about that. Okay, so anyway, Henry is now married to Anne Boleyn, and she produces a child named Elizabeth. Well, it didn't take too long for things to sour between them. Again, she's not giving him a son. This is very upsetting for him because at this time there was no understanding of biology and the fact that it's actually him that determines the sex, not the woman. But at the time, it's just what it was. And so he was very disappointed with this in terms of heirs, very disappointed with this marriage. And again, his eyes began to wander. And he ended up meeting this woman, Jane Seymour, who, oddly enough, was one of Anne's ladies in waiting. Okay? So, with Anne Boleyn, though, he got a little crazy. He ended up having her arrested and brought up on several charges. There were charges of witchcraft and, all kinds of crazy stuff that came up. And she was actually beheaded, whereas this marriage was just annulled. Anne Boleyn was actually beheaded by Henry VIII, okay? Which left him free to marry Jane Seymour the same year. So he marries Jane Seymour, and lo and behold, she gives him the son that he has been wanting, and he's thrilled. So Edward VI is born in 1537. Now, Edward was pretty sickly his whole life. He really was not a robust child as far as his health goes. And as far, just to complete the circle around Jane Seymour, she actually died a couple of weeks after Edward was born. So his first wife he divorced, or they call it annulled. His second wife he had beheaded, and his third wife died of natural causes. It was 2 or 3 years after Jane Seymour's death before he ended up marrying wife number 4. But these were in rapid succession. Okay.
She died of natural causes?
Well, I think she died due to complications from childbirth, but she wasn't beheaded, and it wasn't the same circumstances over here. It was more natural than beheading, I guess is what I should say. But now King Henry has his heir. All right, now he died when he was 60 years old. And just a little bit before he died, his son, who is now only 9, he is the rightful heir of the throne, being the male child, right? So at 9 years old in 1547, Henry is still alive at this point, but Edward the Sixth begins to rule England at 9 years old. Now, again, Henry is still alive. He's got counseling. He's got this. He's got that. But officially, Edward is the King of England. He only lives another 6 years. Again, he was a sickly boy. I would imagine that the stress and whatnot of being suddenly the ruler over a couple of countries would not help his health any. But by the time he was 15, he died. So now what's going to happen to the throne? So now the male heir is dead. So now we circle back to the oldest female heir, and that would be Mary Tudor. This is after Edward died. So it's weird. The third marriage child, the child from the third marriage, was the first ruler. And then we went back to the first marriage, and she was the second ruler and the third ruler in King Henry's lineage. Okay, so Mary Tudor takes over after her brother passes away, or her half-brother passes away, and she is on the throne for several years. And you read a little bit about her nature. You understand it both from the book and from Fox's Book of Martyrs. She was heavily pro-Catholic. She absolutely was anti-Protestantism, right? When Edward was in, he was Protestant friendly, but again, he really didn't have, this is my personal opinion, being the age that he was just basically doing what his dad wanted him to do. And I don't know that when he was in power that the Protestant, the Reformation had begun, and King, and we're going to talk about this in a second, and Henry VIII had his foot in the, or his iron in the fire about which side he was on. And therefore, I think that Edward was really probably pro-Catholic, but he was not viciously against Protestantism in the way that Mary Tudor was. He didn't necessarily go after people and drive them from the country if they didn't agree with the religious status, right? So he was Protestant friendly, but my personal opinion is that he was basically heavily Catholic. That's how he was raised. His dad was heavily Catholic, but he just wasn't the iron fist that we see that Mary Tudor was when she was reigning. When we talked a little bit about Knox last week, and many other Protestant reformers that we didn't talk about, and not just the reformers, not just the main people, but the people who were beginning to recognize and agree with Protestantism, they were driven out of England in droves whenever Mary Tudor was it's really Mary the First whenever she became queen. So,
how old was she when she ruled as Bloody Mary?
Well, she was born in 1516, and then she took rule in 1553. So, yeah. So she was hardcore. I mean, and not just about Catholic versus Protestant, but she was just a no-nonsense woman. And again, I talked about John Knox and how he has this historical reputation of being a woman hater and, all this stuff. Well, he was driven out of his country by the Queen at the time, and he wasn't really having a female leader like that was sort of breaking the mold anyway. Like, who does that? And so he was having a hard time with tradition being broken, I'm sure. And then being driven out of your country that's a tough thing. So he just didn't agree with her being on the throne, and certainly didn't agree with her policies, at least as far as religion is concerned. So anyway, so then whenever Mary the First died, her sister Elizabeth took over, and she was also very pro-Catholic when you really got down to it, but she was Protestant friendly. She allowed Protestantism back into the country. She allowed people to basically practice whatever they wanted to practice until you cross the line into trying to take her authority over the church. Now, her dad established, right, the authority of the king, or in her case, the Queen of England, being the authority over the church, right? And we're talking about basically the Catholic Church, right? Even though it's called the Church of England. She took that position over any sort of religion in the country. So the Church of England was the official religion of the country, and she was the head over that, but you weren't going to sneak in as a Protestant and somehow usurp her authority over what was going to happen, right? So she was she had her own issues. She was the last in a line of heirs, and blah blah. She had issues secularly and politically that she had to deal with. And yes, the religious aspect of it was one portion, but she just did not go after the Protestant movement the way that her sister did. She was just like, whatever, until you crossed the line and either openly bashed the Church of England or tried to usurp her authority. Then she brought the hammer down because she wasn't going to have that, right? So that was basically, we're talking about a time span that starts with Edward whenever he took the rule in 1547 to the time that Elizabeth died in 1603. So it's not very long, but there was a lot of change as far as how Protestants were treated. First, everyone was there and Protestantism was spreading, and then the hammer came down with Mary, and then people started trickling back into the country when Elizabeth came in.
So, as we're studying all this, are we going to get into present day Church of England?
No, not too much. No, this is just the beginning,
so
how it was established.
Where do they stand nowadays? The Church of England, and when you have the king and the queen and all that kind of stuff out there, where do they? Oh,
I'm sure it's the same. I don't know the answer to the question because I haven't looked that specific question up, but my guess is it's the same. The sovereignty of the queen is over the Church of England. That would be my guess.
Is it Catholic?
It's still the same doctrines that were established. And actually, there's two different names. It's called the Church of England, and it's also called the Anglican Church. As we go into future Protestant Reformation people, that are, second and third and fourth generation from Luther, many of them are Anglican priests. So many of them began in England under the, authority of the Anglican Church. And the doctrine, while not the details of the doctrine, those changed a little bit, and as the governing authorities feel like changing things, they do. But the core of the doctrine never changed. It's still Catholic. And just this is kind of a side note, after Elizabeth died, King James I took over, and his reign was from 1603 to 1625, and it was during that time that the King James Bible, that's where it comes from, that translation of the Bible was established, and that was in 1611, and that is what, the Catholic Church refers back to the Vulgate a lot, to Jerome's translation, and it will also refer to this King James Version quite a bit. I think that mostly it's the Vulgate, but this becomes, this is and stays important to at least the Catholic Church, and even the Protestant Church. The Protestant Church uses the King James Version too. So, okay, so now that's sort of the flow of Henry VIII and the flow of his kids. And it seems like there should be more time that's passed, but it's really a pretty short time in general. But while all of this is going on, just to kind of give you a little bit of a timeline, like while all this stuff is happening. So during some of the first years of his reign, right? So Mary's been born, but we're nowhere near. Henry is still firmly on the throne. This is when Martin Luther comes along in 1517 and has his, business that he does. In 1518, Henry VIII wrote a book called, I have it written down. It's about the seven sacraments. So remember, one of the things that Luther did eventually was he took the seven sacraments that the church practiced and shaved it down to two, right? Baptism and communion. Those are the only two he kept because he said those were the only two that were scriptural, right? The other five were thrown out. In 1518, King Henry VIII put out a book about the seven sacraments, reaffirming the Catholic Church's view of the sacraments and totally slamming Luther, completely going against everything that Luther said. Well, Leo the Tenth, he's the Pope that was going after Luther. If you remember, he was the one who was, oh yeah, come to Rome, let's talk. He sent people off to the Diet of Worms. He was, the whole time. That's all Leo the Tenth. Leo the Tenth found out about this book that Henry had put out, basically endorsing the Catholic view of the sacraments, and gave him a title called the Defender of the Faith. And it's a title that the royalty of England still carry today. They still have that title. And it was given by Leo X shortly after Luther did his thesis nailing. So that's what I mean when I tell you that Henry VIII was Catholic. It's very similar to me. In my mind, it's very similar to Luther. That's how Luther was. He was very Catholic. And then he was born again. He started reading the scriptures on his own, praying on his own, having a relationship that's individual with Jesus on his own. And he started having all these questions. And he expected the church to be as learned as he was, and expected those questions to be met and for reform to happen, because that's the way it should be. But as time went on, he ended up being, excommunicated and sought after and blah, blah, blah. Henry's exactly the same way, except that he didn't care about the doctrine. He wasn't fundamentally against the doctrine of the church. He just had a couple things he wanted to be in control over so that he could live his life the way he wanted to, right? So in general, even though he had done this, well, he actually hadn't done it yet. He didn't split from the church till later. But even though he believed all of these things enough to have written this book and being given this title, he still, because he wanted to live his life the way he wanted to live it, which is very human, he ended up establishing his own church in less than 20 years after he was given this title, right? So it's very interesting. And then And then just as another sort of aligning yourself, Loyola's Jesuits were established just, 6 years after the Church of England was established. So all this history that we've been talking about, where I've just kind of given you dates where you don't really have to, we're not going to be tested over them or whatever. It's still interesting to kind of keep in mind the general time frames that, Luther and Calvin and Knox and Zwingli and all these people, when they were sort of trailblazing the Protestant movement, while all that was happening, all this was happening at the same time. So it's very interesting the way that it went through. All right, so we're going to end tonight's lecture talking about the Council of Trent, which was at least begun at the time that Edward VI was in power. It's a very long council. It was over many years. But we're going to talk about the Council of Trent at the very end of class. Before we leave this time frame, I want to talk about, I want to make sure that you understand that the Church of England is still basically a Catholic church. It's not a Reformed church that moved away from the doctrine. It's really important to understand that. And the branches, one of the denominations that came from the Anglican Church was the Episcopalian Church. If you go to an Episcopalian church, it's very, very similar. I mean, it recites the creeds. It has actual wine for communion. I'm sure they believe in transubstantiation. It's a very Catholic feeling church. And so for someone who doesn't have a grip on history, they could walk into a Roman Catholic church and then the next week walk into an Episcopalian church and not really see huge differences between the two of them. It'll feel the same. And so a lot of people who are Episcopalian, I'm one of those people prior to kind of understanding where all of this comes from, they'll say, oh yeah, I'm Catholic. Well, they are. They really are. They just have a different governing head and they don't realize it. Doctrinally, they're the same, right? But if you ask an Episcopalian how they feel about the Pope, they're not going to say, oh, the Pope schmope. We listen to the Queen of England. They're not going to say that. They're going to say, wow, yeah, the Pope, right? So it's an interesting thing to understand where it comes from and what it's about and how little we as, especially Americans, but how little we understand about our own roots, right? It's basically a Catholic church. It just separated itself because King Henry VIII liked some other lady, right? Basically, that's what it comes down to. Yeah. So, and it's still established. I mean, it's very active today. It's very alive. There are Episcopalian churches all over this country. Church of England is very much alive. I mean, that's what I'm saying. Even though Henry VIII was by and large a secular leader, and history will talk about his secular rulings, he has a huge impact on church history because while it's not its own branch, right? So we have 3 branches so far. We had the main church and then Eastern Orthodoxy they were excommunicated and became their own branch. And then later on, Protestantism came off and they became their own branch. And later on, not much later, you still have the Church of England, but it's not really a branch because there's no doctrinal change. It's still the Catholic Church, but it's still separate. It's bizarre. It's sort of like, if you guys remember from the last lecture when I was trying to somehow get consubstantiation across, it's really hard for me to explain that because it's almost like a mix. And the best way I have been able to explain it is the way Luther explained it. And he said it was like a hot iron in a fire. The two meet one another and they influence one another. Like the iron changes from being cold to hot, which is kind of like the changing of the bread into the actual body of Christ sort of thing. But it doesn't happen outside the body. It happens as you take it in, whatever. But they stay separate, so iron is still iron and fire is still fire. I don't know. It's very hard for me to explain it. Pastor Kahn can probably explain it better given his upbringing and his background. But that's kind of how I see the Church of England. Like, they're very much the same, but different enough that they actually are recognized as different churches. But doctrinally, I don't know how you tell the difference if you were to walk into a Roman Catholic church today and an Episcopalian church tomorrow. My guess would be that it would feel like it's all the same stuff.
Sure.
So.
Except with the Church of England, you can just kill your wife.
Right. Right. If you're the king. Right.
You can't just be.
That's right.
Good.
That's right. Okay. So while all this was going on, there were some denominations. I'm calling them denominations, but because I don't know what else to call them, that began to form especially from the ruling of King Henry and his kids, and especially Mary. Okay, so let's see. I think we can get rid of Edward. He didn't last very long, so we won't refer back to him too much. So there were probably more than what I'm going to give you, but I'm calling these the denominations of the Reformation, but for lack of a better term. But I just want to introduce some of these, because these are going to be names of groups that you have heard before, and it's just interesting where they get their start. Denominations of the Reformation, okay? We're just going to talk about three. Let's see. Okay, so the first one I want to talk about are the Puritans. Most people have heard of the Puritans. Even in your book, there was some reference to Puritans in saying that there are still descendants of Puritans, like the Amish and the Mennonites and blah, blah, blah. But we're not going to talk about that right now. But the Puritans. So these guys are Calvinistic in nature. And you'll notice that Calvinistic in nature. And you'll notice that a lot of these guys are Calvinistic in nature, because it's important to remember that during this time, a lot of these reformers left England and went into France, and they went to Geneva, and they studied under Calvin, and they embraced, they loved the city, they loved the rule, it was clean, it was crime-free, blah, 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 those things we talked about. And so a lot of these initial denominations are Calvinistic in nature. And it makes sense based on the history, right? Okay, so these Puritans, so the key to the Puritans is they were having issues. So these are in England. Just like the Protestant reformers like Luther, they're in the Church of England, and they're, learning these new things from these Protestants that are coming along. And, some have been driven out, some have come back, throughout all these years. And they're saying, okay, our roots are in the Church of England. And so what we really want to do is we don't really want to leave the Church of England. We want to reform it. Very, very much like Luther. That's why he put his thesis together. That's why he nailed him to the church door. His whole point was to say, hey, I found some discrepancies scripturally versus how we're living, and I want to talk about it. The Puritans were in the Church of England. All this business is going on around them. They're learning all these things about Protestantism. They're learning for themselves, and they're saying, hey, but we're Church of England. We don't want to leave the Church of England, but we want the Church of England to reform, right? And so one of the main things that they did that was against what the Church of England would do is that the people chose their own ministers, as opposed to the church hierarchy, or even, I don't know how often the king or the queen would choose. That's a little bit below their pay grade, but still, the layman choosing who is going to pastor over them, as opposed to an ecclesiastical authority saying, this is the person I want to have the authority over you. That was a big deal. But the Puritans, They didn't want to leave the Church of England. They wanted to reform it from the inside, and they wanted to purify it. We want to purify the Church of England. That's why they were called the Puritans. Okay? It's kind of like the, do you remember, I don't remember if we talked about it in this class or if it's just something that I have listened to in teachings at church, but talking about how whenever Christians were first given the name Christian, they were little Christs, and it was not a term of endearment. It was actually a mocking term, and they accepted it willingly because they were like, yeah, we're Christ-like. That's what we're supposed to do. Yeah, we're Christians. Like, they embraced something that was supposed to be a mocking sort of, derogatory term. And I think that, while this wasn't necessarily meant to be derogatory, it's not quite the same, but the people who were trying to label this group of people who were not quite Church of England, not quite Protestant, trying to figure out where they're at because of their proclamations, we want to purify the Church of England, blah, blah, blah. They were like, oh yeah, those are the Puritans. They believe they can purify this and that and the other. They're kind of crazy, right? But anyway, that's how they got their name. It was kind of given to them, kind of like Christian was given. Okay, the second one I want to talk about, they're called the Separatists. They were also known as the Dissenters. Now, these guys, still fundamentally the same people group. They're still rooted in the Church of England. But whereas the Puritans felt like they wanted to stay within the church and reform it, these guys were like, the Church of England, Reformation isn't possible. So they were sort of the glass is half empty. These guys, their glass was half full. These guys, their glass was half empty. They were like, we've got to have some reform. The Church of England's not doing things scripturally. And you guys, live in your pipe dream thinking you can reform the Church of England. These guys said, it's not possible to reform the Church of England, so we're going to separate from it completely, and we're going to become our own group of people. They were also, as time went on, they were known as, these are going to be terms, you may not have heard of separatists or dissenters, but you've probably heard of these terms. They were also known as Congregationalists or Independents. And again, it's because they severed ties with the Church of England and were not interested in trying to reform it. Again, they have a lot of different things that they believed in. They published a book as a group. They published a book called A Book Which Shows the Life and Manners of All True Christians. And it's basically Congregationalist principles. That you can look that up if you're interested in it. They because they were completely separate, they believed that the church should be self-governing. So that's what they did. They had self-governing churches, that there was not any one authority over another, the way that the Church of England had authority over them. They sort of dissipated authority. It doesn't mean that they didn't have a hierarchy of elders or deacons that were scriptural, but in general, they didn't have like a pope that told them what to do, or a regional priest that told them what to do, or a king that told them what to do. They were basically self-governing.
And what's the time frames of these?
It's during all of this time.
Oh,
like, it's going all these things were forming at the time that, especially after Bloody Mary, because so many of them were pushed out. These guys were also Calvinistic. I didn't write it, but these guys are also Calvinistic. But these guys, all these people were pushed out. A lot of them went into Geneva and learned under Calvin. And then when Elizabeth came in, they began to trickle back in because the persecution went down, and they brought Calvinist ideas with them, re-entered, so to speak, the Church of England, for lack of a better term, and then realized that we have some big disparities, just like Luther did. We have some big disparities. Ooh, let's try to reform the church. Let's purify it. We're Puritans. Oh no, there's no way that's ever going to happen. Just forget it. We're going to separate. We're going to be self-governing. We're going to have our own hierarchy. We're not going to have anybody ruling over us. We're going to do our own thing over here. Okay. They believed that it was a church duty to help each other. A lot of that goes across boundaries, though. All right. I thought there was a third one I wanted to talk about, but I guess not. So we'll just talk about those because I hope I can remember to link this back when the time comes, or maybe you'll remember, whenever the colonists start forming, we'll start hearing about certain men who came over from different areas, but some will come from England and they'll say, a Puritan so-and-so. And suddenly they started this colony that you've heard of, and this church has come from it. And sometimes those churches are still established on the East Coast. This person came over, they're a Congregationalist. This person came over, they're a Separatist, which is probably the same thing. Do you know what I mean? Like if you understand a Puritan and a Separatist and the fact that those groups were formed during this time after Henry VIII, and lots of things came from them, which is what makes everything so confusing. I mean, it's sort of like in our theology class, whenever Pastor Walter is telling us, you're either a Calvinist or an Arminianist or you're not. You can't really be a 3-point Calvinist and you can't be a 2-point Arminianist or, whatever. It's kind of the same. I mean, if you can dissect down to the root all of these denominations, especially those that started in the colonies whenever we get there here in America, I think that a lot of the things that are so confusing is, for lack of a better term, and I'm making this up, this doesn't actually exist, but like there's a, 3-point Congregationalist. Oh, I'm a 6-point Puritanist. You know what I mean? Like they had their doctrines laid out, like in the book that I was just talking about. They have their doctrines laid out. And so then as people begin to grow and evolve, which may or may not be a good thing, well, we like this point and this point, but not so much this point. So basically, I'm a Congregationalist, but I don't believe this, so now I'm over here. And you'll see all of these. It almost feels like they're contradicting themselves. You'll start trying to figure out, where did all this stuff come from? And all these people are claiming to be Puritans, and all these people are original people are claiming to be Congregationalists or Independents or whatever. And you're like, well, you can't all be everything. Like, what is happening? And it's my opinion, without having been able to dissect it myself, that a lot of it is because there's all these things that are set up originally, and then as time goes on, people are like, oh yeah, we'll take those 4, we'll leave those 2, and we'll come over here.
Right.
We'll take 2 from here, 3 from here, and we'll come over here.
And how many denominations we have now?
Right, and so it gets very dicey to try to really figure out. These original guys, you can figure it out because they're hardcore, came over from England. I'm a Congregationalist. No. We want to reform the Church of England. I'm a Puritan, But then as things begin to spread out in this country, I don't know. It's just a little foggy. It's kind of difficult to work through the whole thing. But anyway, so just keep in mind Puritans and Congregationalists. And it doesn't help that they have 3 or 4 names. So you're reading something and they'll say, oh yeah, it's independent in root. Well, if you're not a church history person, that can just mean, the word independent to me just means that they are not dependent, right? Okay, well, these guys are independent too. This could be described as an independent group of religious people, but not independents. Do you see what I'm saying? The words themselves overlap. It just gets real foggy, real fast. So as you're reading, if you can remember Puritan, and it seems like Congregationalists are independent. These are the ones that I hear, or I've seen most, or maybe it's because of the ones I know, and so I recognize them. So I think those are the ones I see most, and I don't recognize what I don't know. But if you can keep those in mind, just in general, as you are reading something that has nothing to do with church history, you're just reading something and all of a sudden you find out, oh, this person has Puritan roots, blah, blah. You're like, wait a minute, Church of England trying to reform the church. Wow, that dates back a long ways. It probably goes back to this person that started this church in this colony, blah, 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 right?
Right.
Anyway, so we have just a few more minutes. So that's basically what's going on in England. And while all this other stuff is going on, either outside the country during Mary's reign or inside the country during, Edward and Elizabeth. Okay? So they sort of all wrap around each other. And Henry VIII is so crazy. Like, it's hard to keep his life straight. It's super hard. Like, his third marriage produced his first heir. I mean, already you're kind of like swimming around in whatever. So anyway, but that's Henry VIII and his influence on church history. It's a big one.
He died when he was married to Jane Seymour?
No. He had 3 more wives. He died when he was like 60 years old.
Oh, he had 3 more than that.
Yeah, he had 3 more because she died. Oh, I already erased it. She died whenever Edward was the same year that Edward was born. And then it was like 3 years later and he married wife, or 2 years later, he married wife number 4. And it just carries on and on. So no, he lived well beyond all of this.
So what happened to his future wives?
We would have to look it up.
Oh.
I actually didn't study any of them. But it's a real quick read if you trust, like, I think Britannica and, encyclopedic sources like that. If you Google wives of Henry VIII, and I never use Wikipedia because I don't necessarily trust it, especially if I'm going to be saying it, to you guys like it's true. I don't read Wikipedia because of my position. Wikipedia is a great source as long as you realize that just the general public can post to that. It doesn't mean it's wrong. It may mean that it's not fact checked. That's all. But if you look in like Britannica and some of those other sources that are fact checked, you can get a nice lineup of who he married, when they married him, how the marriage dissolved, whether it was beheading or annulment or whatever. You can get an idea of what's going on with that. But I did not study it. It took me a while to get this.
You knew everything.
No. Oh, no, not at all. Okay. So all of this has been happening basically. So everything we've been talking about is all about the beginning of the Protestant movement and even the beginnings of the Church of England, right? So we really haven't talked, except for the formation of the Jesuits and talking about Loyola last week, we really haven't talked about the Catholic Church in a while. So let's end tonight talking a little bit about the Catholic Church's perspective of all of this stuff that's been going on. All right, so depending on your viewpoint, on the author of whatever it is that you are reading, if you're asking the question, okay, let me start this a different way. So shortly after Edward took the throne, the Catholic Church convened the first of 3 meetings that formed one large general council called the Council of Trent. The first one met whenever Edward was in power, but it spans quite a long time, 1545 all the way up to 1563. Now, this was not one long council. They had 3 separate meetings, but those 3 meetings were compiled and kept under the umbrella of one single ecumenical council, okay? Now, this is what I started saying a minute ago and I backtracked. The Council of Trent, if you ask a Catholic-based person, by and large, if someone says, why was the Council of Trent called? Because these other ecumenical councils that we have talked about, they've been called in response to something, right? The very first council was a response to Arian, right? Or Arius and his heresy. And then we talked to the Council of Constance and how Huss was brought there, blah, blah, right? So in general, Up to this point, councils, ecumenical councils had been called in response to something. The church was being questioned or even sometimes attacked. In the case of Arius, it was like a doctrinal attack. They're being somehow violated or questioned, and the church and the questioning that's happening is causing a ruckus. People are beginning to get confused. The people who are in the Catholic Church, they are beginning to get confused and not sure what's going on and what do we believe and whatever. And the church says, whoa, we need to, as a church body, as an authority, we need to meet, figure out what's going on, get these questions answered, and disseminate that information so that the people who trust us with their eternity know what's going on and what the church believes, right? That's what all the councils, for the most part, they have been in response to something. So, for whatever reason, it's very interesting. For whatever reason, if you read, not all, but if you read some writings that are trying to answer the question, why was the Council of Trent convened? And they are Catholic in origin, so they'll have a Catholic Church bias. Many times, not always, but many times they will say that it is simply and strictly a time that the church chose to reform and define its doctrine. So it was almost like an internal, not reformation as in change in doctrine, but like an internal checks and balances almost. So the Catholic Church would say that the Council of Trent was convened in order to make sure that what the church is putting out to the public is what the church means to put out to the public. Let's make sure we are doing what we're supposed to be doing based on the scripture, on our tradition, on the things that we hold sacred, right? So that's in general. And I won't say 100% because I think that's not fair. But in general, the Catholic Church will say that the Council of Trent was called as an internal checkpoint for the Catholic Church so that they're disseminating appropriate information. Protestant views will say that it is completely and totally a response to the Protestant movement. Not a response to the Church of England because doctrinally they were pretty much the same. Although some of the things that came out of the Council of Trent do fly in the face of at least what King Henry did with the Church of England, with marriage and other things like that, the small things, if you want to call it that. So, from a Protestant viewpoint, this was a response to the Reformation, or to the Protestant Reformation. Okay? So don't be surprised. I mean, if you are speaking to someone who is Catholic and you call this a response to the Protestant movement and they become upset, just understand that they have a different viewpoint on why it was called. Right or wrong, left or right, I'm not here to say that. I can say that all the other councils were called in response to something, so it makes sense that this would be called in response to something, but it's not for me to try to say what the Catholic Church was actually, it's just not for me to say that. But I'm giving you the Protestant view on the Council of Trent, okay? Okay, so this Council of Trent, I think I wrote down... I did. Okay, so I told you that there were 3 convenings of this council. So the first one was from 1545 to 1547. The second one was from 1551 to 1552. And the third one was from 1562 to 1563. So they're only convening, and whenever I put these dates in, that's not January 1545 to December 1547. It doesn't mean it was 2 full years of meetings. It could have been, I actually don't know the answer to this, it could have been November 1545 to April 47, whatever. But this was the longest meeting. And then they got a little bit shorter and a little bit further apart as they went along. But in general, all three of these fall under the umbrella of one ecumenical council. Okay. So, some of the things that came from each of these councils, and this is just information. I'm not going to quiz you on which council brought about what idea or what was confirmed where. But the Latin Vulgate was confirmed during this first, meaning that it's still considered authority. Okay. All 7 sacraments were confirmed. And Luther's justification by faith alone was rejected. Formally rejected at the first meeting. There were other things. I'm just giving you a few for each one. For the second council, transubstantiation was confirmed.
That's when they believe the body and blood becomes Jesus.
Not to say they didn't believe it. I think I spelled that wrong. There may only be one S. Not to say that the church did not believe that prior to the council. They are reconfirming it. Okay. Penance was defined. Last rites or extreme unction, those were also defined. They call it extreme unction. So if you decide you want to look up the Council of Trent, they'll call it extreme unction. In this third one, the Mass was defined as the true sacrifice. And that goes right along with transubstantiation. There is a re-sacrificing of Christ with the Mass. And then they also made basically doctrinal statements. Some of these are confirmations, some of them may be expansions, but doctrinal statements about things like marriage. Oops. Wow. Purgatory, indulgences, etc., etc. So the Council of Trent, as far as Catholic doctrine is concerned, all of the ecumenical councils were important. This one was incredibly important with regard to the Protestant Reformation, because many, not all, but many of the statements or the doctrines that were affirmed or reaffirmed or confirmed out of this council flew directly in the face of what was being taught by the Protestants. I want to read a little bit of, now again, this is a document that was put out in 2013, and it is from the viewpoint of a Protestant. A Protestant person wrote this. So, let's see. The primary purpose of this council was to condemn and refute the beliefs of the Protestants, such as Martin Luther and John Calvin, and also to make the set of beliefs in Catholicism even clearer. So the making the beliefs of Catholicism even clearer, that is the stance that you will hear or read many times, that the Catholic viewpoint, we're defining ourselves and being clear. And the Protestants will say, oh, they're just, refuting everything that Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and all those guys did, right? It's two sides of the same coin, quite frankly, so I'm not really sure why it has to be such a big deal. But anyway, so some of the things, and again, this is written from a Protestant viewpoint, and they're not word for word. Some of them are word for word. I'll tell you when it's word for word from the council. So Protestants endorse justification by faith alone, apart from anything, including good works, which is a position of the Catholic Church. During the sixth session of the council, a decree was issued that said, quote, "If anyone saith that the justice received is not preserved and also increased before God through good works, but that the said works are merely the fruits and signs of justification obtained, but not a cause of increase thereof, let him be an anathema." So Luther was saying justification by faith, you don't need all these works, but if you are truly justified in your faith, good works will naturally come from you and fruit will be produced. They're saying, no. They are both required in order to be justified, okay? And I don't know if you've heard the term anathema before. Have you heard that term? Do you know what it means?
I'm not totally sure what it means.
I had not really heard it before I took this class, and so I have it pulled up. This is just Merriam-Webster. Well, it shut on me. Anathema. Okay. One that is cursed by ecclesiastical authority. Someone or something intensely disliked or loathed, usually used as a predicate nominative. Oh, that's grammar. A ban or curse solemnly pronounced by ecclesiastical authority and accompanied by excommunication. The denunciation of something as accursed or a vigorous denunciation or a curse. So by that definition, assuming that it is something that the Catholic Church would agree with, which I can't say, but I'm assuming they would, an anathema is basically saying you're excommunicated, and because you're excommunicated, you're bound for hell. So many times I have read where a Protestant viewpoint will be talking about this, and they'll say, oh yeah, the Catholic Church says if you don't believe in XYZ, you're going to hell. And it comes from this word anathema, which by proxy to excommunication is basically what is being said. So, all right. The Protestant reformers rejected the Apocrypha as part of the biblical canon. The Apocrypha is a collection of ancient Jewish writings and is the title given to those books which were written between 300 and 30 BC in the era between the Old and New Testaments. During the fourth session, the council issued a decree damning anyone who rejected these books. Quote, "If anyone receive not as sacred and canonical the said books entire with all their parts, as they have been used to be read in the Catholic Church, and as they are contained in the Old Latin Vulgate edition, and knowingly and deliberately condemn the traditions aforesaid, let him be an anathema." So that means if you don't accept the Apocrypha, you're not accepting Scripture. Many doctrines unique to Catholicism, such as the teachings of purgatory, prayers for the dead, and salvation by works, are founded in these books in the Apocrypha. During the Protestant Reformation, the doctrine of transubstantiation was heavily criticized. The 13th session reaffirmed and defined transubstantiation as, quote, "that wonderful and singular conversion of the whole substance of the bread into the body, and of the whole substance of the wine into the blood, the species only of the bread and the wine remaining, which conversion indeed the Catholic Church most aptly calls transubstantiation," end quote. So they're defining what it means and reaffirming that that is the correct way to carry a communion service or to understand a communion service. Protestants claimed that the only source and norm for the Christian faith was the Holy Scripture, without the Apocrypha. This doctrine was rejected at Trent. We already talked about that. I think that was the first one we talked about. The council affirmed two sources of special revelation: the Holy Scriptures, for example, all the books included in the Latin Vulgate version, and the traditions of the church, including the unwritten traditions. So that's where, whenever you hear, in this class is a good example, when you hear, so Protestants believe that the scriptures are the authority, and the Catholic Church believes it's the scriptures plus good works, plus the authority of the Pope, plus, it's written or unwritten traditions of the church. That was confirmed at the Council of Trent. In Catholic theology, an indulgence is a remission of temporal punishment due to sin, the guilt of which has been forgiven. Under Catholic teaching, every sin must be purified, either here on earth or after death in a state called purgatory. The selling of indulgences was not part of official Catholic teaching, though in Martin Luther's era, the practice had become common. The council called for the reform of the practice, yet damned those who say, quote, that indulgences are useless or that the church does not have the power to grant them. So they reformed the idea of what indulgences were and what they were to be used for, and et cetera, et cetera. But if you said that the church didn't have the authority to grant an indulgence, then you're out, okay? In the 24th session, in Catholic theology, purgatory is a place or condition of temporal punishment for those who denied yet were not free from venial sins. The council affirmed the doctrine of purgatory and damned anyone who claimed, quote, that after the grace of justification had been received, the guilt is so remitted and the debt of eternal punishment so blotted out for any repentant sinner that no debt of temporal punishment remains to be paid. So basically, if you think that you can just say, God has justified me through the blood of Christ and I'm good to go, and you do not have to pay penance, that is against the doctrine of the Catholic Church. In the 24th session, the council issued decrees on marriage, which affirmed the excellence of celibacy, condemned concubinage, which, that's fine, made the validity of a marriage dependent upon the wedding taking place before a priest and two witnesses. In the case of a divorce, the right of the innocent party to marry again was denied so long as the other party was alive, even if the other party committed adultery. So that was confirmed at the Council of Trent. And finally, the last one I want to say or talk about, that's about the Julian calendar. That one doesn't matter as much. That one's not as interesting. So anyway, that is just one person's viewpoint of the primary points of what came out of the Council of Trent. You can do so much research and find different people's viewpoints of what's important. And I think, if you wanted to really look at the Council of Trent, I think it would do justice to try to find a Catholic site that is talking about the Council of Trent and see it through that lens, and then also a Protestant site and see it through that lens. Because if you do that and you try to remain unbiased, you'll see that for the most part they line up. They're saying the same things about the Council of Trent. It's just that what comes out of it, the Catholic Church adheres to doctrinally, and the Protestant Church just does not. So the lenses can be skewed a little bit based on what you think is right or wrong. But many times, those papers are actually saying exactly the same thing. They just have different opinions about whether it's right or wrong. Just like that question on the test, on the bonus question that said, is it true that the Catholic Church truly believes that they're right and that the Protestant Church are heretics? Just like the Protestant Church truly believes they're right, and they believe that the Catholic Church in some of their doctrines are heresy. Yeah. And when you read those papers and you read the stuff that comes off the internet, you can really tell the bias that comes into them. But by and large, they're saying the same thing. They just don't agree with the outcome. Okay? So anyway, that's the Council of Trent. It's an important ecumenical council. And we're going to talk about two more, Vatican I and Vatican II. Those are also very important, but we'll get to them whenever we get there on the timeline. So Council of Trent, kind of a response from the Protestant viewpoint. It's a response to all the stuff that had been happening since Martin Luther nailed his theses to the door. And Queen Mary drove all those people under out of England and into the hands of Protestant reformers who were ready to teach them, Calvin being one of them. Okay? Make sense? All right, guys. We have a test that is going to happen in 2 weeks. I think I will tell you for sure next week. If I cannot get everything in next week that I need to, since I'm behind on the Reformation, I spent too much time on the Reformation. Because we're going to go into the Age of Revival. If I can't get through everything that I need to get through, then I may push the test back another week. But I'll let you know for sure next week what's going to happen. So next week, I'm either going to come with a study guide ready for you guys to take the test in 2 weeks, or I'm going to come next week with a lecture, and then the following week bring you a study guide, and we'll push the test back. So I'll just have to see how much I have to skip, and if I think that it's worth skipping. And if I decide that I really don't want to skip it, then we'll push the test back. Okay? All right. Thanks, guys. Oh, let's end in prayer real quick. Heavenly Father, thank you for this time. Thank you for the attention that these students are giving to this subject. Lord, I just ask you to bless them abundantly in the time that they're able to give to reading and studying and just trying to make connections. Lord, I pray that you would just shower them with understanding and root in those things that you would have them know. And we ask it in your name, Jesus. Amen.